Hello, you're watching Classic Ed, and in this video I'm going to talk a bit about how I improve my body in paint. Now, like many people, I used to go down to Halfords, get a load of Rattle cans, come back, but be rather disappointed with the results. However, during the pandemic I watched a ton of YouTube videos and did a load of practice on my different project cars, to the point where now I actually get results similar to what you'd expect from a body shop. So in this video I'm going to share with you some of the products and techniques that I learnt about along the way.
So I'm just going to largely talk about the different techniques that seem to work for me. They're drawn from a range of different sources. You know, I watched a video here or read a book there and I thought, oh, I quite like the sound of that, quite like the look of that, whatever. So I'm just going to go through them largely talking rather than demonstrating out on the cars. And if there's a particular point that I pick up on that you want to know more about, then find a video on YouTube that's more specific to that and we'll actually demonstrate it. So the first thing that really improved my results was using something called guide coat. Now, a very common issue with rattle can jobs, particularly with rattle can primers, is that it's very difficult to get your substrate if you've got like filler or other imperfections in the panel. It's very difficult to get the substrate completely flat to the point where when you go to put the primer on, you don't get like imprints of different surfaces and things on the substrate underneath it, because obviously if you don't eliminate those imprints from the primer, they're just going to be there in the base and the clear, and you'll never be able to get rid of them. So you have to get rid of them before, or as best you can, before you put the primer down. And guide coat helps with that because it's essentially very thin layer of paint. You just kind of almost like brush on. It's also available as a powder that just very lightly sticks to surfaces. And what it does is that by putting that thin layer over it, when you come along with your sanding block and you move the sanding block across the surface, the block will obviously knock the guide coat off the highs first, leaving the guide coat in the lows and the scratches and whatever it might be, and that makes those lows and scratches a lot easier to identify, so that you can keep working on the surface until the point where you can put a fresh coat of guide coat on, go over with the sanding block, and you'll find that all the guide coat will have evenly been removed from the surface, and then you know there are no more imperfections. Now, the next one I'd say is use a decent primer, because most rattle can primers, to be honest, do not have enough build, but some do. And what I tend to use is U-POL number 8 acid etch for bare metal, and then I move to U-POL number 5, which is a high build primer, and that's a really nice product I've found. I've also recently discovered this stuff, although I haven't used it much, which is a Frost 2K high build primer in a can. It is 2K, but it is apparently isocyanate free, which is obviously a very good thing, because as some of you will probably know, isocyanates is nasty stuff and not something that the home painter should really be using on a regular basis, unless they have the appropriate PPE for that. Even if you use your guide coat really well and do a really good job blocking and sanding your surface, you will probably find, if that's your basic kind of metal surface or whatever, and let's say you have a little bit of filler, you know, a few patches here, I'm obviously exaggerating for effect, but let's say you've got some highs and lows on the surface here, your filler, and initially when you spray down your primer, even with this stuff, which is pretty thick, the primer will tend to follow the contours of the undulations, the imperfections in the surface. Now, this is less true if you're going from a spray gun, because the spray pattern is just so much bigger and there's so much more volume and pressure and all the rest of it. From a rattle can though, it just doesn't have the air pressure and to distribute enough paint, so it will tend to just follow those contours, right? So obviously to knock that flat, you've got to have a little bit of build, because if you just put more and more on top, particularly, you know, because you've got to go fairly thin with rattle can paint, if you layer it up as one wet coat, it kind of does, you know, weird stuff. So you'll be layering it up, right? But what that will tend to do is that the individual layers of paint will just layer on top of the contours, and that will sort of get to the point, you know, where you just sort of see the contours and they're just getting bigger and bigger and you keep putting more and more paint on them. So what you need to do is get a primer that's got enough build like this one, so you can build it up a little bit, and then when you take your sanding block with your, you know, nice coarse grit, you then knock it flat like that. Obviously it would help if I could draw a straight line properly. Knock it flat like that, and that will then give you a nice smooth surface. But you need a primer with a decent build in order to do that. Right, so the next one I'd say is use a decent sanding block to get your primer and filler and whatever level. So for a long time, I would use these relatively small squidgy sanding blocks, and when I was going over primer, it would kind of look fairly flat to me. But what I realized is that because this has too much give in it and is not large enough, there were actually these kind of subtle waves in the primer surface that I wasn't, you know, fully eliminated. So as I just demonstrated with the high build primer, if you don't use a big enough sanding block, you will find that you'll get these very subtle kind of waves and undulations in the primer surface that won't appear to the naked eye at this stage. It'll look like it's all been sanded off fine, but those waves will only reappear later once you've done the clear coat, and by that stage obviously it's too late, because no amount of flattening the clear coat will stop you, unless you've laid it really thick, but again, you're not going to be layering it really thick with a rattle can, will stop that effect, you know, whereby the base and the clear will then just sit on top of those contours. And the reason you don't see the contours at the primer stage is that primer and also base coat is fairly matte. So the human eye doesn't pick up on the very subtle undulations, because we're talking like microns here. But the moment you put that clear over the top and buff it and gloss it, clear, because it's so glossy, will reflect, the little undulations will reflect off each other and the light, and it will reflect the light in kind of weird directions, giving you an uneven surface that you'll find very, very difficult to eliminate simply by flattening the clear coat. So if you get it right at the primer stage, using a proper block, so I use these Dura blocks, and they come in different sizes, and crucially they're very rigid, which means you can run them across a surface and you can pretty much guarantee that you'll get flat filler and flat primer. Now, a variation on that issue is that as well as using a decent sized block, you've also got to use quite a coarse grit initially at the primer stage. Now, I was surprised to read on this guy that actually U-Pol say you can start with 180 to 240 with this stuff, which seems very coarse for a rattle can. Because what I used to do, I would take my squidgy sanding block and I would use like a 400 grit or something like that, and I would just go over my surface with 400 grit like this, and it would all look nice and, you know, sanded off without any scratches and all the rest of it. But going back to what I was saying earlier, there would be these waves. So in order to eliminate that, not only do you need a big block, but you also need a decent, like this is a 180 grit strip that's designed just to stick onto these blocks, and again, that will get you nice and flat initially, and then you can move up to the grits. And I would actually recommend, particularly if you're spraying metallics, that you start with 180 or 240 and go all the way up through the grits to 600 or 800. I'll explain a little bit in a minute about why that's important. Now, obviously, if you are starting with 180, you have to have a good build on this, and I would very much recommend doing lots of thinner layers than a lower number of thicker and wetter ones. And the reason I'd say so is because with 1K rattle cans, they typically rely on solvent evaporation in order to cure. And if you put a really thick layer on in one go, what happens is that the solvents that are right close to the substrate can't really get out through the paint above them, and you get this effect whereby the top layer kind of dries before that, you know, from that below, which you don't really want, because it causes issues and it means you can sometimes break into the primer while sanding and things like that. It also just takes longer to dry. So by all means, build this up but do it gradually and make sure that the surface is completely dry and stable before you go to your coarse grits. Now, the reason I said earlier to go up to 600 or 800 is that if you're spraying quite a heavy metallic paint like a red or something like this, so this is Rioja Red 601 that I use on the P38, and this is actually technically a metallic paint, so it's even harder to paint than a regular metallic. And even at 400, there are enough micronic sort of micro scratches in the surface for those particles in the metallic paint to kind of fall into and therefore not distribute evenly. And I'll talk a little bit in a minute in the next kind of tip about why the distribution of metallic particles is so important when you're trying to get a decent finish on a metallic paint. Now, I recently realised that I've been making a mistake with spraying metallics for quite a long time. Now, if you're spraying a solid colour, provided the underlying primer base is is flat, the spray technique and the finish doesn't matter so much, because if you've got a bit of build on it, you can always just sand it flat again and then put the clear on top and it'll look good. Metallics, however, aren't that forgiving, and I realised that I was falling into this trap that I think a lot of people do with Rattle cans, of holding the can too close to the surface and also putting too much paint on in one go. And the reason that people do that is because Rattle cans fundamentally don't get good coverage, and they don't get particularly good build, and the build that they do get leaves quite a coarse finish. And as a solution to that, people try to put more paint down at once in the belief that it'll dry flatter. So what actually happens though when you do this is that because the Rattle can doesn't have the propulsion force of a gun with a compressor, the metallic particles inside the paint tend to concentrate more in the center of the spray pattern and less on the outside, and that's why you get this kind of like striping effect if you go in hard with metallics on the surface in one go. The other thing that happens is that, particularly on a vertical surface, if you spray on the metallic paint base coat really thick, it may not necessarily look like it's running, but what probably is happening is that those particles that give it the metallic finish are swimming around, moving around in a way you don't want them to, and on a vertical surface actually falling down the surface. So the solution to this is actually to spray further out with metallics, and again go back to that very light, thin coat. Obviously it will take much longer to get the build, but it's worth it because it means that the particles will be distributed more evenly. And the other thing that helps is that in order to ensure that even distribution, you want to sometimes vary the spray pattern. So let's say this is like a square panel. If you did like your coverage coat like this, maybe switch to the other direction, do it that way, and again that just makes sure that you've got all those particles down in a kind of even manner, and there won't be any areas on the surface that are heavier in particles than others. I mean, what's really frustrating about this is that, first of all, you can't sand metallics because that will disturb the pattern in of itself, and also you won't often see the striping and the clumping that might be there until you've put clear on top, because metallics, they look shiny as you're building them up, but then they dry and they go matte, and with the matte finish you can't really tell what's going on with the particles, because those particles only come to life once they have a lacquer over the top of them, and by that stage again it's too late, because if your metallic's messed up you're going to have to get rid of all the clear coat again, and you're going to have to do the metallic surface all over again, because unlike the solid you can't just sand it down. Now you might be concerned that if you're doing a thinner, lighter coat with your base coat, that would leave a coarser finish, which of course with metallics you can't sand. But what I found is that that's very much the lesser of the two evils compared to putting it on thicker and ending up with a blotchy or stripy finish. And if you've got your primer level beneath it, you'll have a nice layer of base that is fundamentally level, if you've sprayed it evenly, even if it might be multiple kind of smaller coats, then if you have a decent clear on top, that clear will just melt that coarseness away from the base, from the top of the base coat, and you just won't see it. That is my experience. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. So probably the most significant revelation for me with Rattle can spray painting was finding a decent lacquers that actually give you a nice glossy finish. Now, as far as 1K products are concerned, I really like U-POL number 1, and it's probably the best off-the-shelf product you can get in Halfords in the UK. And I've had reasonable success with this, sanding and buffing it to that high gloss, because the traditional issue with 1K lacquers is that you spray them on, and because they're coming from a can, they dry like really unevenly and kind of like a sort of satin, more of a satin finish, even the ones that claim to be like a high gloss. You then go to try and sand them, and even with like 2,500-3,000 grit, you end up sanding through them pretty quickly. And even if you don't do it at that stage, as soon as you take any kind of moderately aggressive compound with a polisher, you just kind of burn through them. They just don't have the weight and build to withstand it. U-POL number 1 is possibly an exception to that, but if you really want to take your lacquer to the next level and the overall finish and get that kind of body shop look, you do really need a 2K product, which just has a lot more build and strength to it. Now, the big downside of the 2K products is they do normally have isocyanates in them, and UK health and safety guidance is to wear an air-fed mask when using 2K products. Now, I don't possess such a thing, but I do occasionally use this. I wear a very good face mask with organic filters, and I normally just use this stuff outside. I'm fairly comfortable with that, given that I only use this maybe once or twice a month at the most. But as I get a bit more into my body and paint, I am seriously considering getting that air-fed mask. So that's the big caveat with the 2K products. But the big advantage of these is the build they give you, and they're just so much stronger because they're still in a can. They still won't go down as evenly as you would get from a gun and a compressor. So you're still going to have to sand and buff these to a certain extent, but because they have so much more strength to them than the 1K products, you can actually do that. And provided you follow the technique with the correct sanding and polishing technique, you will achieve a perfectly flat finish that looks like it came out of a body shop. Now, even with the best spray technique, and in fact even with a gun to a lesser extent, you will get a bit of a wave in your clear coat at the top, even though the your surfaces below will be flat. And the way to get rid of that and level it so that you get a completely flat and even high gloss finish is to sand the clear coat. And that's where this guy comes into his own, because the 2K stuff is just that much more resilient to that process, and can be buffed to that high gloss afterwards without without burning through it. Now, opinions vary as to exactly what grits to start and end the sanding process with, but most people seem to suggest going from about 1500 grit and going up to 3000 before machine polishing afterwards. So we're now talking wet sanding, so you need lots of water and a bit of soap in that water as well to give it a bit more lubrication. And the size of the block is now less important, because these waves in the clear coat, although they're visible, they are hopefully by an order of magnitude less than those that you'll be dealing with in the primer earlier on. But you still want a reasonably as large of a block as is comfortable, and a block that's still nice and rigid and will hold the paper with a nice even pressure on the surface that you're moving on. And just as before with your different grits, start somewhere and then go up through the grit. So if you start at 1500, go then 2000, 2500, 3000, etc. Don't skip the grits out, because the principles of you eliminate the sanding scratches of the prior coarser grit, they still apply. Now, when you start off with, say, your 1500, what you're looking for is an even matte surface on the top of the clear coat. So just as before when you were sanding your primer, initially when you run that block over the top, it'll knock the gloss off the highs but leave gloss in the low spots. So you want to keep going, until all the gloss has been eliminated from the surface, and at that point that tells you that you're now flat. And provided you've got enough thickness in your clear coat, you shouldn't burn through it. You should just be left with this nice, obviously thinner but still thick enough straight edge on the top of the clear coat underneath where you started with. All the grits above the 1500 or wherever you started are really more about just removing the scratches of the coarser grit that got the surface flat in the first place. So what you should end up with is a completely flat, matte and scratch free, to the naked eye at least. There will still be some scratches in there even from 3000 grit, but that's the job of the polisher later. And then you've got a nice even surface to then take the compounds and the machine polisher to, which will then bring back that high gloss finish. Right, so let's talk about the final stage of the process, which is buffing and polishing. Now, if you want specific guidance on how to physically use a rotary polisher or a DA on a panel, I'd find a video that's specific to that, because I'm going to focus more on just what I use these tools for and the order in which I use them. Now, for years, I was a bit afraid of getting a rotary polisher because I was worried that I wouldn't know how to use it properly, and that if I tried to use it, I'd end up wrecking my paint jobs. But I found that my DA, my dual action, which I'd had for a long time for paint correction duties, was not really powerful enough to bite through and restore, sanded clear coat to a high gloss finish. So I went out and got a rotary polisher, which was a really good decision, but I ended up buying two because this one, the Clark, is a bit of a monster. And although it's great for bonnets and doors and things like that, where you've got a big area that you want to cover quickly, it's a bit overkill for the smaller jobs and can actually end up doing more damage than good. So I also got this guy from cleanmycar.co.uk, which is a bit more versatile because it has multiple sizes on the backing plate, and also has like extensions of different lengths on the shaft, which again helps you get to smaller, more intricate areas. So I tend to find that I use this more on the smaller jobs, but they fundamentally do the same thing. They're a rotary action with no dual or orbital action or anything like that. They just spin really fast, and that's why it's so important when you're using them that you don't stop on the surface, because you will burn through it, because they generate a lot of heat. Now that heat is fundamentally how they generate their cut, but it's important that heat is evenly distributed and you don't allow it to concentrate in one place. Now, in terms of what pads to use, a lot of people advocate, perhaps more traditionally, to start with a wool pad, because it is a higher cut or a faster cut than a foam. Now, I would say that you can start with a harder, firmer foam pad, because wool really is quite aggressive. And again, if you've maybe got a thinner layer of clear and are maybe not so experienced with using these with buffing, then the wool might just be a bit much, and you might be better off just taking a little bit longer and using a firmer foam pad to start off with. Now, in terms of the foam pads, they basically come in hard, medium and soft, and different manufacturers use like different colors to indicate which the pad is. It doesn't seem particularly standardized to me, but you can tell by feeling the pad. So this pad, I believe, is a kind of a medium pad. A harder pad that you'd start with will feel a lot firmer to the touch, and a softer pad will be a lot squidgier. So that's kind of like a medium. Now, in terms of what compounds to use, again, there are like a million different opinions and products out there. I find the whole subject area really confusing, but I've chosen, a system that seems to work for me, even though it might not be like the best thing out there. So I use the kind of three-step 3M process, which starts with Fast Cut Plus, which is like quite a hard and fast acting compound. So that would go on your rotary polisher, on either your wool pad or your firm foam pad. and that's really good at restoring the shine really quickly. But it won't finish the panel. You'll still be left with quite a lot of swirl marks and holograms and things like that in the surface that you need to eliminate. Now, some people, experienced professionals, will finish the job and they'll do all the stages with the rotary polishers. I have not reached that level of proficiency yet, and I find that I prefer to take a little bit longer and get more consistent results by switching to the DA with a medium to soft pad after I've done the initial blitz to restore the shine with the rotaries. So after having used this guy with the rotaries and got all the shine back, I then will go to, for example, the medium polish, the medium 3M polish they call Extra Fine Plus, but I will do that with the DA, and I find that is more effective at just evenly removing all the swirl marks and holograms from the surface. Now, obviously the DA is a completely different technique to the rotary. With the rotary, you just kind of keep it moving and just kind of swirl all around the panel. The DA requires a very, much more linear, slower technique, which I find a lot more easier. I find a lot easier to use. But that's the nice thing about the DA. You put your polish compound on, whatever. You start in a certain place. You go in a straight line. You go back, overlapping a little bit, and lo and behold, after you finish, you wipe it all off with a microfiber cloth, and all your swirl marks are gone. Now, the 3M process is 3-step. The fast cut, then the yellow, which is the Ultra Extra Fine Plus, which is meant to be the medium step, and then the Ultra Fina SE to finish. To be honest, I find the finish after this one on the DA and a medium pad to be perfectly acceptable, but if you go over with the Ultra Fina and the soft pad, you will just get a little bit more gloss, and those very minute swirl marks that you might only see in the brightest of direct sunlight will be more consistently eliminated if you use that one. But either way, that's the process that works really well for me.
I hope you found at least some of that video useful. I'm aware that at the best of times, body and paint can be quite a controversial topic. So if you think I did anything wrong or could have done anything better, then please leave a comment below. Otherwise, I'll be back with more action on the cards very soon.